we chose a provocative title, and it seemed to have worked. Where do great ideas come from? And I think the first thing is, so great ideas in what context and for whom? I mean, a great idea is not always a great idea. So I think the first part of the presentation, and I hope I'm not standing in the way of the slides, but I think the slides are not kind of that terribly informative, just a visual support of what we are going to say, is to give you a little bit of the context. Who is the Rockefeller Foundation? Many might have heard the name, but I think it's useful just to maybe have a little bit more of a sense of who we are and from what perspective we are coming at this. So the Rockefeller Foundation, founded in 1913 by John D. Rockefeller, so a private American foundation, and we celebrated our 100-year anniversary last year, so quite exciting times. And over the course of our past, innovation and new ideas have always been pretty much the focus of the work we do. Today, we understand ourselves as a global foundation. We have offices, our headquarters are in New York, we have offices in Africa and in Asia, and a conference center in Bellagio, Italy. We pay out about $140 million per year, and we have about 170 employees. So those are the kind of parameters that we operate in. And but the 100-year anniversary that we had last year was a great opportunity to really understand more deeply what's our past and where do we come from. And it's also interesting in the sense kind of what has changed and what hasn't changed. So what hasn't changed is that we are still looking for what are the things that could still have significant impact on the lives of poor or vulnerable people. But I think the way we go about it has changed significantly. I mean, you see in the background here, some of the things that we have been involved in. But if you think about when you read the materials in the archives, how these things came about, and some of my colleagues describing it, what they heard from kind of previous colleagues who were there, it was pretty much a network of old white guys or middle-aged white guys, and kind of a small scene. Everybody knew each other, and so kind of that is how initially, at least probably in the first 50, 60 years or more, the foundation tried to identify ideas to address the humanity's biggest challenges. I think another piece of it that you might associate the foundation with is as scientific philanthropy. I think that's probably something that is very strongly connected to our brand. And here we described it as backing brains. So these are the number of Nobel Prize laureates that we have backed in those different disciplines. So it also illustrates where did good ideas from our perspective come from previously. They came very much from academia. Today, 140 million is next to nothing, but at the time when we were founded, we are the second oldest foundation in the United States, and at the time when we were founded in 1913, Congress actually had to approve of our charter because the American government was worried that we might have too much power when it came to influencing foreign policy. So that gives you kind of an impression of kind of the role that the of the size that the Rockefeller Foundation had at the time. And so we clearly invested much more in basic and fundamental research as the source of great ideas. I'm not saying that's no longer where great ideas are coming from, but clearly the context and the environment that we are operating in has changed greatly. Rachel and I are actually going to take turns a little bit to make this more lively, so she will more talk about today.
Yeah, so we can keep jumping up and down. Feel free to join in with us on that. So, of course, the world has changed a lot since 1913 when we were founded, and the two kind of core goals that we're oriented around with an eye towards making an impact on the poor and vulnerable are around advancing inclusive economies and building greater resilience. So around inclusive economies, we're thinking really about expanding opportunity worldwide, and with resilience, it's really about helping people and communities and institutions prepare for shocks and ultimately emerge stronger from them. And kind of underneath these two goals, there are four core focus areas that we really see as the crucial systems towards advancing these goals, ultimately towards making an impact on the lives of the poor and vulnerable. So the first is around health. And an example, we tend to focus, I would say here, more on systems work, less on some of the kind of specific disease-focused work. And an example of our work here is around transforming health systems, where we've looked to kind of make the case for universal health coverage in low and middle income countries. With livelihoods, which is around expanding opportunity, particularly for the poor and vulnerable. An example of our work here is Digital Jobs Africa, which aims to help catalyze 1 million new technology sector jobs in Africa. Moving into ecosystems. Here we're kind of looking to move beyond kind of conservation and preservation and really think about integrating ecosystems approaches into economic work, into social work, etc. And an example of work here is our Asian Cities Climate Change Resilience Network, where we're working with a number of cities throughout Asia on integrating climate change resilience into their urban planning and policy and general management. And lastly, around transform cities, we really, this is about the fact that the world is rapidly urbanizing. More than half of the population is in urban areas now. So we really want to be focused on kind of the dynamism there. We'll also sort of note that, how does this affect our role? That's kind of a key question for us, given the kind of change and uncertainty in the world right now. So first, I would say we're very interested in new ideas. We have a sense that while some old approaches have been incredibly successful and tremendous, there's really a need for new ideas. At the same time, we also see that while Claudia mentioned the foundation was initially viewed as sort of concerning by the U.S. government in 1913 for the type of influence we could have on policy. Well, now there are so many actors and a lot of support from the public sector as well towards scaling up ideas that work. So in many ways for us now is sort of, we really see our role as testing, as sourcing, and ultimately adapting new ideas and then handing them off to those oftentimes who are really focused on scaling up. So we typically think of that as philanthropic risk capital. But we're not interested in new ideas for simply because of how novel they are. We're interested in having a deep problem-solving approach, and that remains a core focus. And we often do focus on problems that usually require coordination across different sectors, private, public, nonprofit, and where we can really play a role in helping to convene these different actors around the problem. I'll also, just to sort of transition into the next question, which is, well, where do great ideas come from? We're interested in new ideas, so where do they emerge from? And we've sort of, Sarah, launched this event by framing this question for us. So in our context, where we're thinking about making transformative impacts for the poor and vulnerable, there are probably three, well, probably much more actually, but there are three ways that we often conceive of a great idea. So the first is a problem. So if an idea is a problem and then you work to sort of address that problem, clearly it's going to be pressing, it's going to be driven by really where there are urgent needs. On the other hand, if an idea is a solution, the work around it will really build off of what has already been done, off of what has already been learned. And then lastly, if an idea is an opportunity, well, then we're starting with something a bit sort of more tailored to the particular institution, something that where an approach is a bit more constructed. So ideally, we think that an approach to sourcing new ideas should allow for kind of all elements from all three of these areas. So that will sort of lead us into the approach that we've been taking, as Claudia mentioned, over the last few years.
So this is the model, we call it our intervention model, but this is basically the model how we identify and implement our programmatic work. So we are not organized around programs or permanent programs, but we really have adopted what we call an initiative model, and that initiative model is time-bound. We identify over the course of these 4 phases tangible goals that we want to achieve over a time period of, let's say, 7 to 9 years, and those goals are guiding the work. This was developed about 2 to 3 years ago. This kind of the kind of processes that I'm going to describe in a little bit more detail in the next couple of minutes. In reaction to that, we really wanted to systematize our approach and what kind of ideas are moving forward. Because ultimately, you can imagine, we get a lot of proposals. We hear a lot of ideas. I mean, I always said we get about 5,000, we counted it once, so we get about 5,000 ideas per year and probably more. And many of these ideas, the vast majority of those ideas have merit. So it's not a question of merit or could we do great work in these areas. I think the question is ultimately for us, can we as the Rockefeller Foundation on any of these topics have outsized impact? So I think our guiding principle is really, what are the areas, where can we identify those ideas where we could have outsized impact for the money that we can invest. And when you think about it in terms of our initiatives, so over the course of an initiative life cycle, we invest around $100 million. So over the time period of 7 to 9 years, $100 million. And when you think about many of the problems that we want to tackle and that Rachel already referenced, that's a drop in the bucket. And so we really need to think very strategically and very consciously about what we can do with the 170 people that we have in-house. So I don't know if you can see it here. It might not come through very clearly, but there are these dots. So it's clearly a funnel idea. So we want one principle that we use to design these processes is that in the first phase, what we call the scanning, so the explorative part, where we want to identify ideas, we want to be very broad. And then we want to kind of hone in and have clear criteria and decision processes that support this process, kind of to move us from phase to phase. But in the first phase, clearly, we want to be able to look at a lot of ideas very quickly. It's also resource thinking behind it, so a certain efficiency in some ways, if you want to call it that, built into the process, that we told ourselves, okay, we want to only invest so much in the, let's say, the 50 or 60 problems that we investigate at the very beginning of the process, and then basically that number that we dedicate increases significantly. Rachel already said it or mentioned it. So there are different ways of kind of how you identify ideas. One thing that is a guiding principle for us is that we have taken a problem-driven approach. So again, we get a lot of ideas. We are also only human beings, so we get enamored with ideas. And I think one of the challenges that foundation have is they have a great degree of freedom. And so in wanting to make sure that we really spend the money that we have most wisely and most in the benefit of those that we care about, we want to make sure that we don't only get enamored with ideas, but that they clearly address that a problem that is critical for the populations that we care about. And I can talk a little bit more about that as well. But I think one thing that I want to emphasize after you have seen that kind of funnel or linear process, just to also note that, of course, there are feedback loops, and in some ways the linear presentation doesn't do the process justice, because, of course, the problems that we want to address, and you know this as well as we do, are complex problems and can be understood in very different ways. So in some ways, we identify a problem, we frame it in a certain way, then we learn about it, and then we probably have to go back maybe to some of the earlier phases and to understand it more deeply, so that that we don't. That we really do those problems justice. And I think this is an important aspect here is clearly also that when you think about these different phases, that one thing that is very different from what I shared about how we operated in the past, that this is very much about also bringing in others, and is about bringing a diversity of perspectives. So if you have a problem, regardless what it is, but let's say competition for fresh water, it's a problem that we recently worked on, and you can frame it in many different ways. So what are the root causes of the problem of the scarcity of water? And whoever you ask, people will say it's a human right problem, or it's a justice problem, or it's a problem of leaking infrastructure. So there are many different ways of how you could come at it. And I think to tease out all of those perspectives, bringing in a diversity of people is critical and important, and not only rely on academia or the scientific as we maybe did more so in the past. And for that purpose, we do, for example, innovation and idea laboratories to really bring people together that are not only experts on the topics, but that who can also look at these things from a different perspective. I think I already mentioned some of the principles that we adopted in designing this process. So yes, we want to be efficient with our money and our time in looking at that. I think reinforcing objectivity is really a major departure from how we worked in the past, where it was, so foundations or a foundation such as the Rockefeller Foundation had a program, there was a head of a program, and the program could run for 20 years or longer. And basically that person was very influential in identifying what are the next big thing that we are going to work on. And it was and while this person might have very well been and many times was a world-renowned expert, it was only one perspective to bring to bear on that problem. And so what we are trying to do now is to have a team. So we basically have separated the investigating team from the implementing team. So my team is trying to answer the question whether there is an opportunity for the foundation to have significant impact. Then we hand it over to a team of experts. But all to say, it's about understanding and reinforcing objectivity in the way how we select ideas. Connected to that is that we investigate multiple ideas at the same time. So it's not looking at one idea necessarily, so looking at is there something that we could do about obesity in the US, but looking at that at the same time with, let's say, competition for fresh water. And then, of course, those are apples and oranges. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But I think we're using a similar framework, and so we are through that we want to support and facilitate senior management's judgment to make a decision where could the Rockefeller Foundation have more significant impact. And so it's a very evidence-based approach that we are using to do mainly then the idea assessment as well as the idea identification. The criteria are always very interesting to people. So they say, well, you have this kind of process, but what are really the criteria to move these things through the pipeline? And I think for an audience such as this, and as we want to bring in others into this work and collaborate more strongly. So as you can see here, you already probably get a sense of some of these things are generalizable, and some of these things naturally have to be specific to Rockefeller. But I mean, some of the things that are generalizable are So I already spoke about this. Is this a pressing problem for poor or vulnerable populations? So we try to understand who's affected by this problem. What are the sheer numbers? In which regions? Is there kind of a segmentation that we could think about? What is the depth of impact? What is the severity that this problem has of populations that we care about? And what's the forward-looking trajectory of the problem? So those are some of the things that we investigate here. The second criterion that I maybe spend a few sentences on, because it's critically important for how we think about our strategy and our approach, is what we call dynamism or dynamic spaces. And you might wonder, well, what is that? But coming back to, we are now a mid-sized American foundation. You have heard how much we pay out per year, how much we spend on our initiatives. And so we are not going to move the needle on any of these big topics alone. So we really need to think about, is there something that we can catalyze? And so we have adopted a lot of thinking from the future community, a strategic foresight community, as well as from systems thinking and other related disciplines, to think about, do we see early signals that something in a space is changing? So is there something that we could catalyze and use towards addressing the problem? And I think Rachel will give an example of that, what that concretely means around urban food insecurity that we will talk about in a moment. I think the other things are probably pretty self-explanatory. So we want to understand what's the potential for innovation. And then there are things where we still want to understand, so does this match kind of our mission, our goals, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of this is a little mostly spoken in the abstract, but let's get a little bit more concrete. So we talk about this work in cycles. So I already said we are conducting these things, multiple things at the same time, and we talk about these, then doing this work in cycles. So this is from cycle 3. So we identified 20 topics at the time, and you can see they are framed as problems. So that's why when I said we are taking a problem-driven approach. We use our goals that Rachel described, resilience and more inclusive economies, and our 4 issue areas, and use that as a filter to understand what are really significant problems that we could think of and address. And we investigate those relatively quickly, and then put those forward for decision making and deliberate with our colleagues. So which one of these, based on the criteria that I showed on the slide before, are worth advancing to the next stage where we do a much deeper investigation. And these 20 were basically filtered down from a larger set of 50 or 60. We do interviews. We have a network of scanners in different parts of the world. We do secondary research, so we have multiple sources, but plan to expand that basis more broadly going forward. And then, again, just to give you an example of how this runs through the process that I described in the abstract a little bit earlier. These are the 3, we call them searches, or opportunity assessments might be another word to use, that basically from the 20 were advanced. And you can see, they're connected to our issue areas or our broad thematic areas, but basically those were the 3 that we selected and that we currently, until last week or so, investigated in more depth. So, Rachel, you've now described that in a little bit more specificity.
So I'm just going to walk us through an example of one of these. So it was noted as a search in that pipeline slide, but it's an opportunity assessment, essentially. So I'm going to share sort of some summary slides about our urban food insecurity opportunity assessment. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about the content in terms of urban food insecurity content. I'd love to speak about it at the reception later if anyone's interested. But the focus will really be on how we bring those criteria to life through our opportunity assessment process. So we start by really getting a sense of the context. So here we're understanding that urbanization is happening rapidly, that it's 50% of low and middle income countries, and also that the problem's pressing. In this case, it's 370 million people that we know are affected by urban food insecurity. And then based on the context, we also start to look at how addressed the problem is. Is there a lot of work already taking place around it? Is it more of an open space? And in the case of urban food insecurity, we did identify that it was a relative open space. And there are lots of indicators we could look at for how addressed a problem is. In this case, the examples I'm using are newspaper articles over the course of a decade and US Foundation grants. So once we have a broader sense of the context and the problem, we then try and look at the system failures that are really driving that problem. So this is sort of how pressing is the problem. On the one side, we want to understand its urgency, its scale, and its scope. And then on the other side, we want to understand, well, what's driving all of that? What are these system failures? So in this case, we really honed in on two systems failures that, again, I'm not going to go in detail into the content. But one was really around how do the urban poor, who are particularly exposed to market food prices, how do they cope with how volatile and changing those prices are? And the second system failure we ultimately honed in on was around urban food systems not delivering nutritious and food that is affordable to the poor. And a lot of that we really identified was driven by the kind of physical urban environment for lower income people. And again, just to kind of flag what Claudia was saying about our methods, we're doing this through a partnership, and we're doing it through a number of research interviews with experts in diverse fields. In this case, we had a number of innovation sourcing sessions. We had 2 global Twitter chats to really understand kind of perspectives in different places and on-the-ground perspectives. Moving into dynamism. So here we're trying to not only just surface what are the dynamic spaces, but also how do they relate to each other. So do they come together pretty clearly? So there's a real window and opening for change. Is the overall level of dynamism relatively low, as in the problem is static, there's really not much happening, and there are barriers to change happening? On the other hand, are there a number of dynamic spaces, but are they kind of fragmented and don't clearly fit together? This is what we're looking at. And similarly with our innovation landscape, in addition to seeing what the actual innovations are that relate to the particular problem, we also want to see how they speak together. Are they being configured together in certain ways to create more systemic change? Are they kind of fragmented and dispersed? And then lastly, we do propose a sort of opportunity. So getting at, again, where do great ideas come from? What is a great idea? So beginning with this kind of problem-driven way that we're seeing an idea, we ultimately move to sort of seeing an idea as a potential opportunity, as an opportunity area. And we do try and work with those opportunity areas so that they emerge from the sort of areas of innovation and dynamism that we're exploring. So that concludes our comments. For once, we're actually under the amount of time that we had allocated for this, which is always a thrilling experience. So we're eager to hear from you and also to share a few of our questions.